I have to say that just being here in this room and listening, especially to Ed, over the last few minutes, has put me in a somewhat different frame of mind than I visualized when I prepared my talk. And I feel moved to say a couple things that I hadn't planned to say. First, just want to thank Ed for his vision and impatience and generosity in creating the center. Lord knows he did not create it to benefit people like me, but I've been here now 8.5 years, and it's been a really important part of my life, and I've been glad to be able to contribute, and I'm grateful for his vision because of the way it made space for me to contribute. And something similar goes for Nancy. The other thing is I also have a strong sense of the history that is in this room. I can become obsessed with history, which is to say I can become interested in it to a fault. And so I really am genuinely interested in hearing from those who were quite involved 10 years ago and before and after, not just telling you what I think. So I'm going to offer you some retrospective thoughts, but I do so with great humility because I've always been on the sidelines of these developments. I want to just mention first some of the contributions that CGD has made over the years to the history, at least since 2000. We have been both, or I should say we've been a convener, practical intellectual, and even served the role of practitioner in dealing with these issues. To give you a sense of what I mean by convener, I think technically the last event that we did on debt straight ahead, I might be wrong about this, was back in 2004. And at that time, one of the people we invited was the Undersecretary for International Affairs at the Treasury, John Taylor. He had begun to think with his staff about next steps on debt relief. This, of course, was a few years after the Enhanced HIPC initiative had been passed and funded. And so he writes here in his memoirs, this is called The Global Financial Warrior. To test the possibility of a bolder initiative, on April 2nd, 2004, I called the debt experts, the Africa experts, the World Bank experts, and the IMF experts on my staff into my office for a brainstorming session. I was hoping for a free-flowing, non-bureaucratic discussion, and I got it. The immediate issue concerned what I would say at an upcoming event on debt relief on April 22nd. The Center for Global Development, a new Washington think tank, was sponsoring the event. Toward the end of the brainstorming session, I asked what people thought about a proposal to completely cancel the debt that the heavily indebted poor countries, HIPCs, owe to IDA, which is, of course, the concessional lending arm of the World Bank. That is 100% cancellation, well beyond what had been proposed before. And he goes on to describe how he discussed this with staff, and then to prepare his remarks, he jotted down 5 principles that ought to guide policy in this area going forward on what he describes as a small piece of paper, but I've also heard described as a napkin. And that was the basis for his remarks. He called, for example, for more debt relief, which was significant coming from him, and for a systematic shift toward grant funding and a reduction in lending to the extent necessary to maintain debt sustainability going forward. So, and that became what is now called the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative, or MIDRI. And he also refers to his something like his talented young staff who turned this into a reality. And that includes Bobby Pittman, a good friend of the center, and also Ben Leo, who is, I'm happy to say, now a colleague here. Is he going to appear this afternoon or no? We're not sure.
Todd Moss is going to fill in for him.
Okay. Unfortunately, he's sick. Very unfortunately, because he worked very hard on this event. So Todd Moss will be filling in for him. We've also made contributions. For example, the Nigeria debt story, many of you know. I want to be very brief, but Nancy and Todd especially provided the critical intellectual infrastructure that brought together creditors and debtors to do a deal that eliminated $30 billion of debt for Nigeria. Also, Steve Radelet, who is now a senior advisor for Secretary Clinton, worked for many years splitting his time between CGD and the government of Liberia, where one of his great labors was helping Liberia go through the really complicated process of getting debt relief, and that culminated in success just a few months ago with $5 billion in debt relief for Nigeria. So in the rest of my time, I'd just like to offer you some reflections based on work I began this summer, as Lawrence explained, and didn't finish because I got into a very historical mode and began writing at a level of detail that just prevented me from finishing now. So that's why I've offered in the handouts a 4 or 5 page essay that abstracts some of the themes that I've come to so far. I very much welcome your comments on that essay and on my comments, because this is very much a work in progress. The first point or reflection is that working here in Washington back in the late 90s, I experienced Jubilee 2000 as a phenomenon that burst onto the scene around 1998 and then shut down by design a couple of years later. And in that time, of course, it pushed creditors to substantially revise and accelerate and deepen the debt relief that they're offering. And it also permanently changed how we think of debt and debt relief. After Jubilee 2000 and related movements, at the multilateral agencies such as the World Bank and the IMF, debt relief was no longer heresy. So the point is it appeared all of a sudden and it made a big impact. Looking back at the history this summer, I realized that actually Jubilee 2000 was one chapter in a much longer story. Back in 1985, in 1985 there was the Live Aid concert in the UK led by Bob Geldof. And so a year later, Oxfam launched a campaign for debt relief. And it put out the message, something like, for every £1 we all gave for famine relief to Africa in 1985, the West took back £2 in debt payments. And the campaign was very media savvy. In other words, if you go back and look at what they were saying and how they were doing it, there's a lot of modern resonance to it. And within a year, the UK government was out in front within the G7 on debt relief. It is the reason that in 1988, the G7 in Toronto, made their first sort of official offer of debt relief. Rather modest, but nevertheless it happened. It was also the UK government that pushed at the 50th anniversary annual meetings of the World Bank and IMF for the World Bank and IMF staff to study the multilateral debt relief problem with an eye towards achieving a clear exit strategy. So it was at the time, the UK government was helping the institutions tiptoe towards admitting that they had a debt problem and that they would need to deal with it probably by canceling some debt. And of course, the Jubilee 2000 movement began British. Okay, my second point, and maybe this is obvious, well, maybe I should qualify my first point. There were a lot of Americans doing very good work here, starting in the 80s, including Seamus Finn, who you will be hearing from in a while, on debt relief and structural adjustment, and especially as the battle moved to DC in the late 90s, they became very important. So the second point is just, it's worth emphasizing the role of churches and religious organizations within the movement. I'm thinking of Christian Aid, CAFOD in the UK, the Episcopal Church, World Jewish Service, do I have it right? Many other groups of many denominations, sorry if I've got it wrong, in many countries. And in fact, it appears to me that the Jubilee 2000 frame, that idea, was developed 3 times independently in the early 1990s, all by fairly religious people. The first time was by Martin Dent, an Anglican, I think, political science professor in England, who was he really had the idea and he thought a campaign could be built around it, but didn't have the prowess to actually do it. Then there was Isabel Carter, who was an evangelical, also in English, who had this vision. She actually felt called by God to start a campaign for Jubilee in the year 2000 to end third world debt. And she eventually hooked up with Martin Dent and responded to that calling by starting the original charity called Jubilee 2000 and ultimately hiring Ann Pettifor, who led the campaign. The third deeply religious person who came up with this framing was the Pope, Pope John Paul II, who as early as 1994 was writing about the idea of canceling debt in preparation for the third millennium. But what's important to understand, of course, is that the Jubilee 2000 movement was not exclusively religious. It was both religious and secular. It had this religious resonance, which is powerful in ways that I don't think I need to explain. But it went beyond that. And I think it shares that characteristic with other important and successful social movements. I'm thinking of the anti-slavery movement 200 years ago in the UK. I suspect the abolitionist movement here, and then also the civil rights movement, the 1960s here, which came to be led, of course, by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, it's kind of funny to juxtapose these 2 points I've made about the origins in the UK and the religious angle, because the UK is one of the world's most secular nations. And I think there's something interesting there to figure out. I don't quite understand it. Okay, my third point. The movement was responding to a real problem. That also might seem like a funny thing to say, rather obvious. But it actually wasn't completely obvious. One could have made the case, people did make the case, that the debt situation of the HIPICs, these heavily indebted poor countries, It was a morass, it was a mess, it was a quagmire, but it was not a grave crisis. It wasn't a costly crisis, because the HIPCs were actually receiving more in new grants and loans than they were spending servicing the old loans. In other words, maybe the debtors weren't paying their debts, but the creditors were. But looking again at the numbers this summer, I came to see more clearly that the HIPCs were not really in some kind of happy debt equilibrium. This is actually surprisingly hard to discern from the standard debt statistics that the World Bank collects. I tried to show you what I mean in the first graph. There's a legal-sized piece of paper like this in the booklet, and it's got 6 numbered graphs on there. If you go to graph 1. Look first at the dark green and dark blue bars along the bottom of graph 1. Those show principal and interest actually paid by HIPCs. Okay? Now, if you compare that to the bottom of the black lines, which is receipts of new loans, you can see that generally the HIPCs were getting more new loans than they were paying on old ones, although the margin was often rather tight and probably negative in some countries. Now, if you add in all the grants, which is the top black line, then things looked much better. It did not look like creditors were squeezing the HIPCs dry, which is often the accusation. However, if you look a little bit more carefully, things are not quite so clear. I've also added some light blue and green bars, which is debt service due but not paid, which is actually rather difficult. This is one of these places where I want to say, this is really hard. You should be impressed. I do a lot of number crunching to get these numbers, and there's some error in them. There's some estimations involved. But it turns out that HIPCs were only paying about 40% of debt service due in the late 80s and for much of the 1990s. And that debt service due, what was happening is the debt service was being rescheduled or forgiven at the Paris Club, formally, or it just wasn't being paid and being added to the piles of arrears. And that amount, if it had actually been paid, would have generally been enough to pretty much eat up all the grants and loans coming in. And then if you factor in the fact that a lot of those grants and loans coming in never actually touched the treasury of the receiving government, and therefore wasn't country programmable, couldn't be used for debt service. That's the middle black line. Then you see that things actually were pretty tight, and that there was a real problem, a real structural problem for how aid and grants and loans were being given to these countries. I think one way of summarizing this graph is to say that HIPCs were paying less than half of their debt service due in these years, and much of that probably was only by virtue of receiving new loans to service the old ones. In other words, they're effectively bankrupt. Okay? Not a huge surprise, perhaps. But that leads me to my fourth point. There was, throughout the debt relief movement, and especially in the Jubilee 2000 years, a lot of unrealism from the strongest voices on both sides of the issue, the campaigners and the creditors. The bankruptcy of the HIPCs, if you look at it straight, has a rather inconvenient corollary. Writing off the debts of a bankrupt neither costs much nor is worth much. It's about accepting the fact that the money is gone. It didn't cost the World Bank or the IMF or the French government much, really, to cancel the debts. But what happened is that the NGOs tended to dramatize the benefits of debt relief, and the multilaterals, especially when they were resisting this push, tended to dramatize the costs. And then when they capitulated, then they dramatized the benefits as well. So there's a strange way in which it served the interests of both sides to inflate the stakes. Now, I should say, well, first of all, I say this without questioning the good intentions of anybody involved or even suggesting that any particular person intentionally misled the public. And I also recognize that the way budget processes worked in some countries, it was the nominal value that actually was the cost from the point of view of the bureaucrats that had to get debt relief approved, not the face value, not the true economic value, which could be a factor of 10 difference. Now, to be fair, the NGOs campaigned for more than pure debt relief, and the multilaterals supported them in this. They wanted new aid, and they got new aid. The idea was to maintain the existing flows, gross outflows, while reducing the inflows from the point of view of the creditors. So that meant an increase in net aid. So in a sense, what the Jubilee 2000 campaign was a very effective way of campaigning for more aid. It wasn't just that, but that was kind of the thrust of it. If Jesse Helms probably was more ready to, probably would not have been enthusiastic about approving another $100 million in new aid to HIPCs. A lot of them are pretty corrupt, etc. But $100 million reimbursement to the World Bank to cancel debt in the spirit of Jubilee was more appealing to him, even though arguably it had the same effect in net transfers. And NGOs believing in wanting more aid, it was actually their responsibility to use their most effective arguments. Overall, I would say, in fact, that I think the unrealism on the NGO side was more constructive because it pushed the system in the direction it had to go, which was towards debt cancellation, recognizing that the money was gone. Whereas a lot of the unrealism on the creditor side had the effect of slowing down the process. The debt troubles were arguably clear by the mid-1980s in these poor countries. But 25 years later, we're still cleaning them up. Liberia, DRC, maybe also the other Congo, all just got substantial debt write-downs in the last few months. So why did it take so long? Many G7 debt cancellations offers over the years were incremental and inadequate. There was one point where the IMF sold gold without really selling it. There's just a lot of unrealism. Creditors imposed a lot of conditions, both economic and political, in exchange for accepting the fact that their money was gone, which delayed the ultimate cancellation, and so on. You can contrast this with what happened with the commercial debt crisis. It hit in 1982. In 1989, the Brady Plan came along. Within a few years, compromises were struck between the private creditors, the Western banks and the Japanese banks, and the middle-income countries. And there were no conditions for economic reform, no poverty reduction strategy papers, and so on. They just said, we got to face facts here and get on with things. And it worked, because then capital flows did restart to the middle-income countries. I understand why the HIPC story played out in the way it did, why it's taken so long. But it shouldn't have happened. It shouldn't have taken a quarter century to accept this reality, that the money was gone. And it probably would have taken much longer if it weren't for Jubilee 2000. So in a way, I think Jubilee 2000 has done the creditors a big favor. Okay, now I want to try to get off my high horse a bit here as a critic. It's easy for me to say these things from the sidelines. And I want to congratulate, with all sincerity and respect, the playwrights who actually rolled up their sleeves and got out there and made change happen, however hard it was. Just as the other form of debt that I've been studying, microfinance, has been overhyped, and yet in its own way has done a respectable good for the poor. I think the same can be said for the third world debt movement. The bad debts did get dropped, and you can see that in most of the graphs that are on that sheet. I've showed different indicators of debt distress, and most of them have really improved quite a lot. If you look at what I think is the last one, number 6, you can see that the decline in the number of countries that are not servicing all their debts has been rather slow in this global debt crisis compared to the last 2, which sort of resonates with what I've already said. Okay, my 6th point, maybe I'll start by quoting the title of the press release for the paper that Lawrence mentioned that I did, whatever it was, 9.5 years ago. Forgive, because I've always been very proud of this. Forgive and forget won't fix third world debt. Back then, one of the points I was trying to make in my own small way was that casting debt relief too purely as an act of charity or justice tended to obscure the role of the creditors in creating the problem in the first place, and thereby tended to prevent learning from the past in order to prevent a repeat. And that's why I was so excited. I was sitting in the audience when John Taylor spoke at our debt event back in 2004. I was very quietly going, yeah. Because he was saying, we have to be realistic here. We have to wipe the slate clean, and we have to try to prevent a repeat. And one way they did that was by setting up this new structure with the green lights and the red lights and the yellow lights that are supposed to indicate when it's appropriate to lend more and when grants are needed. And that was based in part on work by Art Cray, who's here today, and also Vikram Nehru, who you'll hear from soon. But there's still this deep problem of how you deal with the pressure to lend within institutions. Generally, you advance your career in a lending institution by lending. I get that from Paul Collier, who made that point very clearly. And there's still that problem at work. And I don't suggest that it's easy to solve, but I feel like it's been obscured by the emphasis on the charity and the justice side of this. Okay, and my 7th and I think last point, I'd offer this question, which I hope is provocative for discussion. Is development lending doomed? If we consider whether to make a particular loan to a Malawi or a Mozambique, we can imagine strong arguments for why that loan is actually better than a grant of equivalent financial cost. The person who perhaps spelled out the logic here best was actually a guy named Wilson Schmidt back in 1964 in the Journal of Political Economy. He was the father of Google CEO Eric Schmidt. So he argued that there really are sound economic reasons at times, there can be, to loan instead of grant. But after Jubilee 2000, I wonder if we're in a world where development loans that make sense ex ante are often, or maybe always, I don't know, uncollectible ex post. So there may be a kind of moral time inconsistency. It makes sense to give the loan in expectations of future repayments, but then you can't actually collect the repayments 10 or 20 years later. Because there's something feels fundamentally amoral or immoral in taking debt service out of the hands of a nation where so many people are indigent or hungry. And what's really going on here is that there's a sort of human intuition or a sense of morality, right? Taking $1 from a poor woman feels more wrong at the margin than not giving her $1. And so as long as there are these return flows, people are going to be able to say, this is wrong. Even if one were to rewind the clock and say, well, you know what, the alternative would have been worse in some sense. It just doesn't cut it. So I wonder whether the long-term trajectory, which has been towards more and more concessionality in aid flows to developing countries, is towards an elimination of development lending. I don't know. Or maybe what we're staggering towards is a regime in which loan cancellation becomes sort of automatic and systematized, which I think would be a good thing. So that loans, in effect, become more like equity. I think it's very interesting that just this year, the IMF, in order to turn its loan to Haiti right after the earthquake into a grant, formally created a new facility that will sort of automatically trigger debt cancellation for countries experiencing severe disasters. Now, the criteria right now are extremely tight so that only Haiti qualifies, but the history of HIPC, the HIPC initiative and MIDRI and these other kinds of institutional innovations is that those are the hard part, getting those new structures in place. Once they're in place, the parameters tend to be weakened or strengthened, depending on your point of view, over time, so that access to debt relief becomes easier and easier. So I wonder if this is sort of the continuing trend, the wedge in the whatever it is, the foot in the door, what do you want to call it? At the launch of my paper when I was working at the World Watch Institute, still waiting for the Jubilee, I had 3 discussants. This is April 2001, I think. 2 of them were Jamie Drummond and Axel van Trotzenberg, who are here today. They were really key players in the Jubilee 2000 story. So it's with great humility that I say I am pleased at this reunion. I don't know if they remember, and I look forward to hearing from them and all the panelists this morning. And I would sincerely welcome your comments, what I've written and what I've just said, in order to help my intellectual work in progress. Thank you.